It's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague and fellow Paul Rudolph Foundation board member, Dan Webre. Dan and I first met during our undergraduate studies at Cooper Union. 2 years his senior, we first collaborated on a scaled model of Renzo Piano's Kansai International Airport. It was a drainage detail. Since then, we collaborated on a series of projects for the Paul Rudolph Foundation, including fabricating models for the World Monuments Fund, hosting tours, making pilgrimages to extant Rudolph sites, even the abandoned juvenile detention center in Bridgeport. We've been writing articles and assisting in research requests as well, and giving presentations in various states. Dan has worked on numerous projects as a project architect at Francois Dominiel Architect, at Anique Pearson Architect, and is currently a project architect at De Queen in Monaco. I'm very excited for him to join me in sharing some of our latest research, so if we can welcome Dan Webre. But first, a note about why we do this. While the power of Rudolph's work is an intense draw, we continue to find many mysteries behind his projects. Never having Rudolph taught to us as students, this has been a self-study. Over time, we've noticed several inconsistencies. Take the Lower Manhattan Expressway project, for example. Framed as a study for the Ford Foundation, it was never intended for construction, yet these iconic drawings begin to take on a life of their own. Especially when presented without proper background in the intent, they can be viewed as representative of the worst evils of urban renewal. And this became the story that self-perpetuates. I found this copy over the summer at a bookshop on the Boulevard Saint-Michel, and the interior explanation addresses the follies of carving highways through cities, but making the project the poster child for all errors in architecture, it sets an irreparable tone. This may be part of Rudolph's own demise for having left his drawings to the public domain, but it's our job to make sure these images are understood and to become one of our priorities to excite new architects and new researchers to understand more about this with advanced scholarship. Within a week after finding this book, I found this at the AA bookshop. Any number of Corbusier projects might have been more fitting, yet Lomex seems to strike a chord. Corbusier does not speak about Lomex in any of this book, partly because he drowned along the French Riviera 2 years before Rudolph even began the project. Likewise, this LP by Nightlands appropriates Lomex for both the cover and inside sleeve art, yet there's no explanation. While these instances promote exposure, they do not engage nor elevate the discourse about Rudolph, what he sought, what he intended, nor what he believed in. However, the Rudolph Foundation is working to change that. There was a slideshow that debuted on Arch Daily on Tuesday for Rudolph's 100th birthday by two architects who are here today, and we've used some of this content to provide, using the whole new technology to provide a new look at some of this work, and we're hoping to pursue that further with our discussion today. Dan?
Down. Okay. So the title of our talk today is The New Space Concept, which is also the title of the book we prepared for today. But before we get into exactly what the new space concept is, I wanted to begin with a quote, which is, I think, my favorite Rudolph quote. "The universal space concept is a denial of the richness and complexity of life that architecture must celebrate. I want to accentuate the differences in our life, not nullify them." So for Rudolph, this idea of space is really this central theme of his architecture. Though he wrote throughout his career, his writings never really tell you the whole story, so you have to piece together from quotes and interviews really what he was getting at. But one of the first essays he wrote was in Perspective 1, which he had identified the three influences in his work, one being the Harvard education with Walter Gropius, European travel, which he received a Wheelwright Fellowship, traveled Europe in 1948 to 49, and experienced naval construction. He was in charge of boat repair and construction at the Brooklyn Navy Yard during World War II. And it's really about the Harvard education that we want to focus on today. And in this essay, Rudolph talks about Gropius outlining what the new space concept is, which is really not a Gropius term, but comes from the book from Siegfried Giedion, Space, Time, and Architecture, The Growth of a New Tradition, which is based on a series of lectures Gideon gave at Harvard shortly before Rudolph arrived there, and was published in his first semester there. And for Gideon, if there's a definition of the new space concept, it is the continuous interpenetration of inner and outer space. But in order to have a new space concept, there must be an old space concept, which was once a new space concept. And that is the idea of Renaissance one-point perspective, the idea of a single viewpoint in measurable space. But this Gideon portrays next to Cubism, which attempts to portray an object or an image from multiple angles within one painting or collage. So you see all the diagonals and curves are fragments of constructing this object, this is a portrait, from multiple different angles with one image. He follows this by presenting two artists, among others, but these were illustrated where the represented object is eliminated entirely. So the focus becomes on pure interrelationships and formal relationships in painting and sculpture. And in terms of architecture, if we think about the Renaissance idea of one-point perspective, one also thinks of the idea of architecture being about clearly expressed geometric volumes. So you can see the concentric circles inscribed within the square in this plan. But for Gideon, the new space concept really begins with Borromini, and he describes the oval figure of the church's interior pressing against the street facade, which is then counteracted by, on opposite sides, two concave surfaces from the exterior. So the resulting undulating surface is a result of interpenetrating inner and outer space, though there's no glazing. This is all done with masonry. And the concept of space penetration came out of Gideon's study of the bridge engineer, Robert Maillard. These were images included in Gideon's book, and if we compare this to, say, a solid masonry bridge, in concrete he's able to achieve a much lighter structure where you can see through the structure and thus the interpenetration of space. And this is probably the most famous spread in the book, which is Picasso on the left and Gropius on the right, which attempts to establish a connection between Cubism and architecture. So Picasso shows the profile and frontal view of the portrait, and similarly he suggests that because of this glazed corner, one can see through the building to see sides of the building one normally wouldn't in a solid structure. Now there's some issues with this comparison. Rudolph indicates this when he talks about the book, which we'll discuss later, but it does establish for him the idea of Cubism relating to architecture. For Rudolph, Cubism in architecture he describes as the invisible plane of Cubism, which transforms visible images as they project across space. And he also talks about the first time he understood space three-dimensionally when he drew, as an undergraduate in Alabama Polytechnic, a shadow cast from one object onto another. So the image on the left, you see a volume of space created by projection of a shadow, which is very close tied to the idea of projecting perspective. And he uses these ideas interchangeably in drawings. So on the left is an early version of the deep perspective drawing that Tim mentioned, which is not new for Rudolph, but also not typical in the 1950s, and it allows him to show a great deal of information about the interior of a space. And his terms that when he's not talking about Cubism or the invisible plane, he also uses the thrust and counter-thrust of space. So in these two projects by Le Corbusier and Frank Lloyd Wright, which were really central to Rudolph's understanding of the two architects, he's showing how the two essentially relate to each other by interlocking thrusts within and outside of the structure. And it's not really an idea comes from reading about Le Corbusier or Wright, but Rudolph's understanding about space. But the simplest way to conceptualize this idea of a spatial thrust is as a room. So on the left, you see Botticelli is able to convey an allegorical relationship between these two figures in adjacent spaces in a view that one normally would never see and if one takes a photograph of an interior, but through perspective projection can create this relationship. And similarly on the right, at Orange County Government Center, all of these individual volumes projecting and receding indicate either a separate room or a space within a room, and the idea being that all of these different types of space juxtaposed against each other have particular relationships which he's trying to present or express on the outside. Another version of this idea of projective space is the Milan Residence, which is very related to the Chardin house of Le Corbusier in its concrete screen. And here you can see the perspective section shows kind of interlocking cubic volumes which are then projected onto the facade, but the concrete screen has its own nature which exists in a tension with interior space. And a variation of this is at Colgate University, in which the concrete screen has an entirely different purpose, which is to be read from a great distance across a valley. This is on a hillside, and the interior spaces project through that screen. But this thrust of space or volume of space is not always a rectilinear volume. Here, this faceted prism is extruded back and forth across the site on different dimensions and scales, and inside these collide and carve out very complex interior spaces. So you can see the balcony on the right shows the same module at 3 different scales. And here is the Graphic Arts Center, in which we have each, which is not the graphic, okay. That's actually, this is a trailer tower, which is from 1954, in which these are all different apartments that are expressed as single spatial volumes. And before, we want to get into 3 particular projects in which we discuss in detail more of these ideas and how they play out.
So the Finney guest cottage is probably the closest Rudolph would come to a didactic Harvard project. Looking at this one drawing, it's a guest cottage, mind you. If I can drive, can everybody see the mouse? You enter in through a carport, you park and face a blank wall. You carry forth through a boardwalk that leads to a bridge to a separate house. So although this is the main event, there's a house to the guest cottage, almost a guest cottage sub. Here, this is the main house itself. We see a worked landscape that's cut at strong geometric angles and a bar that's continuing from one side of the site to the other. Presented to Walter Gropius and Leonard Curie for his 1947 master's thesis, The Weekend House Project at Harvard, Rudolph develops a wood skeleton dressed with infill panels and vertical sliding and plate glass for varying degrees of enclosure, both actual and perceptual. This may be traced to lessons in prefabrication that he experienced with visiting Professor Conrad Waxman. At first blush, it features the elements of the Bauhaus principles that Rudolph would soon adapt to the particular landscape of Florida. The 5 points, as Rudolph understood them, for the Harvard box were clarity of construction, simple volumes, clear geometry, always floating above the landscape, everything reduced to rectilinear shapes, and of course, a flat roof. The youngest in his class at Harvard, Rudolph would internalize these points post-graduation into a buildable proposal for Roberta Finney's parents while working with Ralph Twitchell in Sarasota. Roberta Finney was part of the office at the time, so it was a local client. Situated on a barrier island and separated from the Gulf Coast by a bayou, this post and beam structure seems to float entirely above the composed landscape. The bar of the house stretches the full width of the site, with the fences and paving defining but never quite enclosing its limits. This is quite similar to Mies van der Rohe's exhibition house, which Rudolph would have seen in that fall's Museum of Modern Art exhibition, Mies van der Rohe. Here, the central spine orients the interior, and the views are limited only by the placement of freestanding walls. Rudolph would use this lesson again to reinforce the omnipresent grid, allowing diagonal views at the points where the planes diffused. This technique would be Rudolph's interpretation of Mies's implied space. But whereas Mies's wall planes generate irregular spaces, Rudolph's would come to define rectilinear figures. His wood skeleton of Finney is a departure from the typical reading of articulation of a wood frame structure as a skinned volume. Whereas Professors Gropius and Breuer conceal their frame in the Chamberlain guest cottage, Finney celebrates the autonomy of structure and enclosure by expressing the two independently in an effort to almost evoke steel in a steel frame. The single bar yields an ambiguous reading of solid and void depending on the viewer's vantage point of the exterior. Upon approach, the axial thrust of the boardwalk is counteracted by the lateral counter-thrusts of the interior. It's only broken by the barrier at the parking court as if it was placed there solely to absorb the shock. And that's this bar right here. This masonry wall connects the thrust of the automobile to the rotated column grid of the carport, negotiating the scale and form. So if you notice, these 4 dots, they're almost in portrait, but they're the same module as the rotation of this module within the bar itself. So this is not only a change in scale, but a change from machine to man as you translate through this point. By this rotation, beyond this rotation is the bar of the house itself, this chopped up element. Here the skin peels back at the roof in multiple locations. It starts to frame an exterior room at the entry and allows the chimney flue to penetrate the roof plane without obstruction. At the chimney, the roof plane slides toward the boardwalk, and the sliding roof plane reveals the static skeleton underneath. This is all expressed at this end. By further cutting and offsetting the roof, Rudolph implies that no element is entirely subservient to another, indicating the autonomy of parts beyond their mere assembly. When viewed sectionally, this exposes the tightly spaced organization within. Parallel bands start to run laterally across the site, anchoring each end of programmed living spaces. Separate pavilions for living at one end that are public and private and bedroom at the other, bridged together by a spine of kitchen and services. I'll pull this through. This is the partie where you have a saddlebag. There's the bedroom and the private zones. This is the living room center. This is one of the entrances. This is a secondary entrance. And this whole thrust continues into this one blank wall. An opaque wall at the service bridge terminates the thrust, carving the exterior room. Outside, framing the northern edge of the inlet, the barrier fence interrupts the lateral thrust of the bar, underlining the boardwalk, which continues across the bayou on its own. It's outside of this picture, but this one line would continue across in that aerial view you saw, as a bridge to a separate house. In this way, Finney, the house itself, begins to act as a filter or a gatehouse. And this new expansion begins to grow in section where the fence allows the rise of the boardwalk to continue and rise its head with this outward expansion of the roof from the scale of the individual now, which is translated from the car, to the scale of the ocean beyond the barrier island, translating again through the house itself. Due to his southern roots, Rudolph immediately conceived of the landscape as something to be worked, almost a malleable entity. His action upon sculpting the landscape here is part of the architecture of the house itself. Finney is lifted, but never removed. The lifting demands its own reply. Ultimately, there's no single element or method of operation that dominates another. Each relationship is a moment to expand and elaborate under its own independent set of rules. Here, Rudolph begins to assemble the vocabulary of his language, which will carry forth in projects such as the Deering Residence.
So before we get to the Deering Residence, in between the Finney Residence and Deering, Rudolph spent 48 to 49, as I mentioned, traveling Europe, in which he prepared the ink drawings that were presented of Finney, and he also did a drawing for Rear Development Corporation. This housing group, which was also sent to the editors of Architectural Forum, in which he said, tired of cathedrals and even Le Corbusier, I'm sending you this housing project. So you can see its similarity to this Mies project, and it's probably the closest he would ever come to something of Mies. But you can notice already that Rudolph's much more interested in carving out spaces in between the houses of irregular shapes, carving out the roof plane. But the early 50s was marked predominantly, the most exciting and interesting projects Rudolph did were small guest houses in which he used some technologies he learned from the Navy, but also experimented with varying ways to enclose an open space. So the Walker Guest House has a series of solid panels that can either fully close or fully open the space, which grew out of Finney. And on the right, the Healy Guest House, mostly famous for its catenary roof, which is wrapped in fiberglass, but also for the use of blinds, which can adjust the quality of interior space. But this idea of using such small, or working mostly in small houses, presented certain limitations to his ideas about space. And the architect Hugh Stubbins visited one of these early houses, and his response was there are no surprises inside. Rudolph was, as we saw in the quote in the beginning, very interested in juxtaposing different types of space, so looking for opportunities to explore that. But his first large-scale project, the Wellesley Arts Center, or Jewett Arts Center at Wellesley, shows it was mostly important for its relationship to the campus and detail, which is a neo-Gothic architecture, and he uses the structural bay to connect everything. So from that sense, he was pleased with how the project turned out, but as an interior, he was not pleased. He called this a disaster. He doesn't say exactly why, but there are a few reasons one can guess. But really the idea of space penetration here, we have the passage under the bridge, which connects a visual arts wing with a music wing, but inside there's little interconnection beyond what you see on the exterior. But what Rudolph describes as his first mature project is the Sarasota High School edition, 1958 to 1960, and he calls this the first time that structure is used to serve spatial idea, not the other way around. So from a distance, these concrete screens appear to be a solid volume projecting above the building with a recessed lower story, but as you approach, this begins to dissolve, and he calls this the dissolution of space. Now, just before this project is the Deering Residence, which despite having a very kind of abstract and severe presentation of piers and bearing walls, does show this idea of framing different types of space and showing that they interact together. And like Finney, it's a single block of space facing the ocean in which there's a central thrust at one end which connects the street to the ocean. And inside, he organized the space into roughly 3 zones. On the lower left, you can see a kitchen and dining area in a kind of Miesian plan. And in front of that is a double-height screened porch. And to the right is a series of floating platforms which connect from the porch up to a bedroom wing upstairs, which is then connected to the exterior by a floating bridge. And the idea of the round plan came up earlier, and I think this is a kind of a close approximation of what Rudolph's interpretation of a round plan would be, which if it doesn't come from Loos, it might have come indirectly from Schindler or something, but it really, I think there is a connection there. And of course, the idea of a round plan is not using plans or sections or elevations to conceive of space, but studying the 3-dimensional volumes of separate rooms and adjacencies and views between them. And here's a view inside of the front, this screened porch, which is sort of a part inside, part outside, but it is not conditioned space. And these are the stairs on the right, you can see coming up to the living platform. And from the other view, these 2 sliding planes frame a staircase to the exterior and follow on the left up to a reading zone and another set of stairs to a bridge which connects the bedrooms. And here's a view from the bridge where you see the varying vantages and the intersection of these 2 different types of space, which Rudolph really wants to show how they interact. Especially on the outside where this bridge and stair project through this concrete set of concrete piers. He frames the garage underneath the cantilever reading room. And the idea here I want to convey is I think there's also a connection with Greek Revival architecture, which he studied with Walter Burkhardt, a professor at Alabama Polytechnic, who was working with the Historical American Building Survey to document historical architecture of Alabama. Now, we don't know if Rudolph ever saw this particular plantation in Louisiana, but I think it has a lot of qualities that you can see in Rudolph's work, which especially this thin balcony sandwich between the kind of massive square pillars and this secondary volume inside of the, which is actually the interior of the building. I don't know that Rudolph ever made a connection, I don't think he did, or anyone else, between these two projects. Le Corbusier's Villa Stein de Monzy outside of Paris, but the two do share a bit in common. There are kind of two-story, well, there's more stories in Corbusier's project, but a sandwich of horizontal floor plates on the right and a terrace on the left, which has varying floor levels that convey some juxtaposition of shallow and deep space. And this relationship becomes a little clearer when you look at the plan. Now, Le Corbusier has a garage under the kitchen, which is here on the left, but Rudolph moves his to be under the reading room so that it interlocks with the projecting reading room, and also moves the entrance and Le Corbusier's bridge all into one moment of spatial drama. And I think the relationship becomes a little clearer upstairs, where somehow one can imagine this oval pavilion transforming itself into the balcony in Rudolph's project. Now, this is not a copy-paste, but a total reimagining of something that Rudolph internalized. And here you can see the section where Le Corbusier on the right shows here on the terrace view, one never really gets a view through the building. We think of Gropius' idea of cubism in space is transparency, and Le Corbusier never presents the view through. But Rudolph organizes his space so that there's this interesting seam between the thrust from the ocean and the thrust from the car on the left. And thinking back also to Gideon's comparison with Picasso, Le Corbusier's idea of spatial organization is closely tied to his paintings, which grew out of Cubism, in which depth is conveyed by the relative placement of planes. And similarly, he organizes his facade that way, so though one can never really see into or through the building, depth is conveyed by these elements at different distance from the primary facade. And you can still see a clear indication of a route up the terrace and into the house, though inside none of these planes relate directly to the organization of space inside. But Rudolph's frame, though initially might seem, as I said, kind of an austere, simple house, it really, he makes an effort to express all of these internal relationships on the outside and project them through. And I think especially on the left, you see at dusk, you can see the silhouette of the service cores inside, and it's really almost as if he's presenting a CAT scan or an X-ray of Le Corbusier's organization of space. And from the rear facade, he doesn't show from a distance the clear route inside. One only simply arrives there. And on the right, you can see the secondary internal facade. So there's this interesting idea of never knowing quite when one is outside or inside, but one simply appears in Rudolph's language of volumes and planes.
So for a quick review, at Finney, the bar is defining the cage from which elements and external forces subtract. At Deering, we have a box where thrusts become materialized. At Christian Science, the bar is the least legible of all three, and this is where Rudolph's voice becomes clearest. An outlier in his oeuvre, its organization is the most obscure of all his projects. Though Rudolph's Yale Art and Architecture building from 1963 is an obvious precedent in material and form, the cubic spatiality here is of a far different nature. Directly following the completion of the A&A, the Student Center shares with it several similarities. Both are academic buildings. Both are sited on prominent urban corners. Both are organized as towers, framing a large central space, and both make a point of relating to the neighboring structures and their surrounding while simultaneously closing themselves off in citadel-like forms. In some ways, the ANA could have served as a maquette for Christian Science, which was organized itself like an after-the-fact distillation of those same spatial concepts. Rudolph's design foil in New Haven for the ANA was Lou Kahn's Yale University Art Gallery and Design Center from 1953, which informs much of the design. The volume of the gallery defines an external room between these two buildings. So we're looking on the left from the loading dock, in fact, but there's a tension of space between the facade of Kahn's building and Rudolph's building, and you see the same on the far slide. The volume of the gallery defines this room, and it's held in tension. Shown in context, Rudolph answers his own question of the lines of Kahn's building. Leading to what? This volume leaves a visible imprint of the invisible room created at his gateway to the campus. It establishes a central thrust of the atrium and delineates Rudolph's floor levels. Back at Christian Science, Rudolph's relating in general terms to its context in scale and in profile, mediating between the pitched roof houses that you can see just out of view in this image, as well as an expansive gym and armory that are across the street. To complement these disparate scales, Rudolph begins to abstract the entire exterior from conventional scale-gilding elements. All the windows you see have no mullions, the doors are recessed, as are in full frame, steps are non-existent. So just as with Malevich, Rudolph's reducing form to pure interrelationships. This project was initially granted as a commission to Frank Lloyd Wright. Frank Lloyd Wright passed before he was able to begin work on it. So Wright was clearly on Rudolph's mind. We saw the Usonian kitchen table at Finney, we saw the entry cantilever at Deering, but we think it's Rudolph's textile block houses from the 20s that come with increasing role in Rudolph's work, especially at Christian Science, that inform his design and detailing. Their cubic agglomeration of space, the piers on the end walls expressing ceiling joists. Christian Science was intended to be a fluted block, so it was going to be of a similar scaled unit, and even that was the case once the foundations were poured. They were changed at a late date. They were supposed to look something like Crawford Manor in New Haven, the similar smokestack-like building on the Oak Street connector. These blocks were actually from a company called Plasticrete in the Hamden, New Haven border, and because we got here early, Mari had pulled some materials for us, and we even saw the correspondence between Plasticrete in the archive and Rudolph, and it just became too expensive to fabricate the blocks in Connecticut and have them shipped to Illinois. So it was literally once the foundations were poured that they went to poured-in-place concrete. Plasticrete offered to send the molds to Illinois, but it just didn't work. These were conceived in various footprints to express the verticality of the building in repeated vertical chords. Perhaps it was a simple one-size finish needed to counterbalance the complex program that Rudolph was asked to complete. He had a set of defined uses while simultaneously creating a flexible latitude of space on the interior. This was prime fodder for his critique of Mises' universal space. His early scheme organized the program across 7 interior floor levels in what was essentially a 3-story building. As with the ANA, shifting floor levels were used to define 10 distinct zones of use, 8 of which were ultimately public. As the scheme would evolve, 4 rough quadrants would emerge, each one punctuated by a service and lantern tower, which would reorient the assembly and pin it in place, relieving the vertical thrusts of confluence coming together. This series of diagrams are prepared by Clara Pugsley of the Rudolph Foundation. They were not a chronological sequence, but they're here to exhibit certain actions upon the central block of the space. Forces from the exterior are exerting pressure in. Forces from above are compressing down upon the entrances. Forces from inside are pushing out and expanding the assembly space. As these vertical forces are pinning down 4 service towers and light wells, the volume becomes sculpted. This is similar to how Gideon describes Borromini. In its later resolved form, the plan suggests a pinwheel, a rotation inferred by the 3 walls framing the reception area right here on the lower level. The last, a lantern tower appearing in the corner of the assembly hall. It's hard to see in plan, but it's this double height space open to below. Creates the 4th. The downward thrust on the lounge and washroom block in the upper left displaces the tower laterally towards the pinwheel reception hall, serving as the centripetal center of the building. The lanterns themselves are further subject to manipulation via opposing vertical thrusts, staging a piston-like movement throughout the building. In contrast to La Tourette, which has its come-as-you-are appearance, this is what the concrete looks like when you remove the formwork, Christian Science is a deviation from the machine aesthetic. Rudolph is now embracing the physicality of the concrete, a machine-cast stone, which somehow becomes humanized through the action of the hand-driven 3-pound bush hammering process. Within its abstract gestile environment, the aggressive physicality of the volumes recall a moment of Braque and Picasso when they started to begin incorporating sand and corrugated cardboard into their paintings, engaging a sensory memory in constructing the totality of the architectural organism. As with the A&A, it continues inside and out and is eased by the presence of greenery and vines. You see some hanging. This is an upward view on the right. This now creates a new layering of elements and materials which collapse upon one another in space, much like the collage on the left. The vines come from the drawing process, another hatching technique made physical now in 3 dimensions. When seen in color, this tower with its color blocking is a clear derivative of the gestile precedent of Mondrian. Now, on the right, in Rudolph's own verse, these primary colors give way to earthbound variants of Wright's Cherokee red. Rudolph introduces brick dust, orange, and magenta. These new extensions of the Mondrian-like pattern carry through in its surface articulation, where it begins to accentuate the piston ceilings with their pinwheel windowed towers and even the undersides of the ceiling joists, where the colors become implemented for their own physical properties. At Christian Science, color is used for optical properties to exaggerate 3-dimensional forms. In place of shadow, Rudolph uses magenta as a cooler color underneath the beams, much like the pulsing colors of Albers. As a total work of architecture, these colors permeate the built work, from the expandable assembly hall shown here in its minimum state. I just want to draw your attention to these lines on the floor. This is where there's tracks of sliding panels. You'll see one of, well, this is a door. They all recess back here as well. With its movable panels delineated with scripture, retracted here on the left, you see them pulled apart on the first floor, but they're closed at the mezzanine above, but also shutting off and creating privacy, all onto the balcony. And here you see they couldn't decide what they were doing. So with a retractable floor to boot. So on the upstairs section, we had panels that slid and closed, but in section, the floor actually split and slid towards the assembly space. So the whole building could shift and expand into one large diaphragm action, creating a second tier of balcony seating. And there's unfortunately no view published that we're aware of showing that space. So this is the meeting space on the left, where the floors would terrace out, and this would all become activity space and additional seating for below. So this allows the space on a holiday occasion to expand to a large room while still creating the domestic feel noted on the left. This balance of openness and closure permeates the building. As with the bridge upstairs, it's now allowing the space to unfold into a series of receding trays, creating an itinerant telescoping deep space, much like the living reading zone we saw at Deering. These manipulations, of course, do not just recall gestile painting in form, but also in architectural function, allowing Rudolph to simultaneously address the need for a flexible yet specific space. The mezzanine may be read as a fragment of Wright's own Unity Temple. This is when you enter in and you're just peering through under the balcony to see the assembly space. There's a new terracing of space reflecting upon itself, on what is an otherwise stoic exterior, which suggests volumes but never gives anything away. By contrast, you hear on the primary facade from the street, to the far left you have a garden wall, followed by a chimney, and the big swath to the right is the assembly space. It's all treated in the same fashion, and it's not giving away any clues to what's beyond. Despite its many specific spaces, few would ever be read from the exterior detailing. It's a building that needs to be understood via uncovering, discovering, unfolding, and studying to be fully appreciated. Of course, this is only if you can enter. And yes, even the entry was non-committal. True appreciation is only possible once the visitor makes the effort to become engaged. This is just like Rudolph's early Florida works, which required the user to manipulate jalousie, louvers, sunshades, and panels in his buildings throughout the course of the day, that needed to be unfolded, embraced, and acted upon, each task echoing the architectural moves. Such features demand the user interface, and the building machine begins to disguise itself within. Its post-construction latent energy of the movable panels and floor offer a kinetic energy to activate the building in a new fourth dimension. Hiding its potential, this is the one version of the plan with the 350 seats, but this is the earlier scheme. As an arena for 350 faithful members on holidays, the three-dimensional complexity of this building cannot be accounted for by simply studying the plans in sections. Rudolph, much like Borromini, uses his facades to enclose a molded surface, something Gideon would describe as continuous chains of interrelations. Through this study, more is revealed about Rudolph than any of his individual influences, be that of his teacher, Walter Gropius, or the masters Le Corbusier, Wright, or Mies. To Rudolph, their spatial concepts are essentially interchangeable with one another. This lack of preference suggests that all were worthy influences, waiting for him to reappropriate their respective lessons into his own language. While, as Gideon demonstrated, these artists and architects all spring from the same source. By the time of the Christian Science Student Center at Urbana-Champaign, this thread begins to disappear, and something wholly new emerges as Rudolph finally comes into his own definition of the new space concept. So this preparation is a little sample of some of the work we're doing to date. We chose these three projects in particular because they carry the thread of Rudolph's DNA in terms of space making, but they're also to educate. Many people may not know Finney. It was never built, and it never can be built because Rudolph built another house on that site later. Deering is a private house, so it's hard to get in. And Christian Science was unfortunately demolished in 1986. So as we continue to unlock some of these secrets of Paul Rudolph, we've remained active in the digitizing efforts and agree with everyone who's spoken before us that making more of these holdings available will hopefully excite new research and carry the story further. So we're happy to take any questions. Chris. And you'll let us know your contact, hopefully. Just to give a quick shout out, Chris Wilson is with the Sarasota Architectural Foundation, and they're doing their own program on Rudolph for Sarasota Mod Week. So week, I apologize. So please look them up. Yes?
Well, it's funny, when we came down to research the project, we found in the slides for Deering, there's a slide with your name on it.
Anyone else? Well, thank you.